Over the years, video games of many genres and studios have come and gone. Like anything in pop culture, some have risen and fallen in popularity, been forgotten over a gradual period of time. But that doesn't account for games that are murdered. Whether they get delisted, cease in development, go offline, or all of these at once, disappearing mysteriously, there are video games that have been killed, intentionally forgotten. Some are executed proudly in a blaze of glory, some are found cold and buried the next day, but they always end up in the same place. An ever-growing example of gross mismanagement, corporate greed, and development hell, allow me to tell you the story of the video game murders. Most recently, I threatened to buy my friend a copy of Anthem. Out of respect for that friend and a deep desire to stay theirs, I only ended up buying the game for myself. If you're familiar with Anthem, you might be wondering why. If you don't know that much about Anthem, let me catch you up to speed. Released in early 2019, Anthem was developed by BioWare, the Mass Effect guys, and published by EA, the bad guys. There was a lot of hype leading up to the game's release, especially since this was a time where people were still mostly optimistic about video games in general and didn't yet have a reason to dread the words live service. Anthem looked so cool, characterized by its unique flight mechanics, flashy abilities, and downright gorgeous world. I was among that wide audience looking forward to Anthem's success. I pre-ordered the game, bad call, I played the terribly prepared beta, and I was still excited. Then the game launched. Despite the glaring red flags present in the beta only shortly before the game's February release, I still got on and I played the hell out of Anthem. It had the now common tells of live service from passable gunplay to a barely coherent story, but they delivered on those flashy abilities and that smooth flight-based movement. Unfortunately, Anthem had too many problems to count, most of them also typical of many modern live service games. For example, the terrible launch status, plagued with bugs and missing crucial features, a serious lack of content, a pretty terrible loot system, and of course the certainty that the game came out years too early. The community that the game somehow managed to keep around was spoon-fed minuscule content updates for a few months before they slowed down. This was when the developers had fully shifted to overhauling the game from the ground up to fix the issues with progression, difficulty, and existing content while adding in tons more. Before this Anthem 2.0 ever came to fruition, EA forced BioWare to pull the plug and move on, leaving Anthem with a repeating cycle of dungeons and events with its servers still up for the foreseeable future. That brings us to today. At this point, Anthem is barely a unique story. To be clear, I'm talking about its development, not the game's actual story, which is also pretty bad. There have been tons of games at this point showing plenty of promise and a dedicated community, but were unceremoniously murdered before given a proper chance. Some did get multiple chances, but maybe not the ones that they deserved, and we'll talk about those in a couple of minutes, but let's finish up with Anthem real quick, shall we? Today, Anthem is more or less a dead game. It's dead in just about every way something can die. It's been hit by a car, beaten to death, had a heart attack while lying on the ground, and yet Anthem is still kept on life support by EA. EA and BioWare's pathetic reminder of their failed live service is just sitting there, servers open, still available for purchase, and it'll probably never get so much as a patch or a hotfix again. No one's really playing it, no one's really talking about it either, but it's still there, and when you take a good long look at it, it does kind of make sense. The tired and repetitive mission design consisted of go pick up balls, bring balls back, sometimes from chaotically far away, and put the floating balls into the spikes. The story is nonsensical and embarrassingly boring from the studio it came from. The open world was downright gorgeous and impossibly vertical, but there really wasn't anything to do. Even its endgame content had very little to boast. Sure, it had the game's beautiful open environments and some cool bosses, but even those were at the end of long dungeons with encounters that were way too long and all entirely the same. Each silver lining was attached to one of Anthem's rotting limbs. When BioWare announced the full overhaul that would be Anthem 2.0, people were optimistic. Again. Only a short while later was the game completely killed, and it never got that second chance. This was even at a time where No Man's Sky was well into its redemption arc. The industry had seen what years of hard work can do to a game and its reputation, but I guess that evidence wasn't enough for EA. There are a lot of things that we can take away from Anthem. Stop releasing games too early is a big one. If a game isn't ready to succeed, it won't. You can't fly a plane with one wing, but that's been done to death at this point. It should be clear that publishers aren't listening anymore, and they really haven't for a long time. They're going to keep crunching the developers, and they're definitely going to keep releasing games too early and just assume that players will stick around long enough to see it fixed. But that's where a lot of the problems lie. These games shut down before they have their shot at redemption because they lose their entire player base within weeks, sometimes days of release. When publishers see this, they don't think, oh, this could have used a little more time in the oven. They look at it and assume no one wanted to eat it anyways. In today's gaming landscape, there's no accountability. Blame isn't ever claimed, nor is it shared. It's pinned on whoever's at the bottom of the food chain, most often the game's developers, and then everyone gives up and they move on. I'm not even necessarily saying that these parties shouldn't be blamed. They all should. The game had a terrible history all around from every piece that goes into development and publishing, but Anthem had a lot of promise, and I really think that, sue me. However, Anthem is still playable, something that a lot of these games can't say anymore. To me, Evolve is far and away one of the saddest deaths in video game history. One of my favorite multiplayer games of all time, Evolve had an incredibly unique 4v1 structure, with 4 players controlling hunters divided by class against 1 player controlling a constantly evolving monster. This format may sound pretty familiar to fans of things like Dead by Daylight, but I promise you it is very different, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The game's premier claim to fame was Hunt, a game mode where the monster began the match on the run, starting at a low form of evolution. As the game progressed, they'd have to dodge the hunters by using their senses and try to outsmart them while also engaging in PvE against the wildlife to eat and grow. Once reaching a certain threshold, the monster would have to find a safe spot to evolve, making their abilities stronger and their health pool wider. At stage 1, you were relatively weak, resorting mainly to stealth tactics. By 2, you could be a little bit more confident in your combat abilities, but your chances still wouldn't be all that great against the hunters. Assuming you make it to stage 3, you'll pretty much be an unstoppable killing force, for the most part, at least. Great hunters would make sure you don't even make it that far, but if it does happen, it is still possible to take you down with some near-perfect team play and a decent comp. At any point in the game, if all the hunters die, the monster wins. If they hit stage 3, they can still kill all the hunters, but it also opens up the power relay, which was a massive generator that can now be destroyed. If it does fall to the monster, hunters lose, without having to all be killed. At this point, Evolve is a long-forgotten gem, plagued by an early form of egregious microtransactions and that all-too-familiar lack of consistent content. Evolve went free-to-play in its 2.0 phase in 2016, a little after a year post-release. Come the end of 2016, development on the game had completely halted. While this was a huge blow, Evolve would still be playable until 2018 before its online matchmaking was completely shut down. Peer-to-peer lobbies were still available, so you could play with your friends, or you could even play alone with bots if you really wanted to. In 2022, after an outpouring of support, Turtle Rock, the game's developers, brought the multiplayer servers back online. Until 2023, that is, when Evolve is completely shut down. The game can no longer be played, not even alone with bots. The free version even got delisted on every platform store. Today, Evolve is utterly, absolutely, quite literally unplayable. Kind of, at least. It is actually possible, but it's not easy by any means. The only way is if you owned the game before, or you want to buy a key for like $100. You can't buy it normally anymore. And you can play, but that's only step 1. You then need to legally tamper with the files and legally install some slightly sketchy Chinese software, but it does work. It's just a little frustrating. Solo with bots works, and so does peer-to-peer apparently, but no one I know has it still. The problem with what 2K and Turtle Rock did to Evolve is the complete disregard for the time and money people had put into the game. Not only did people love Evolve, but they actually paid for it. They bought real copies with their own money. Even physical discs for the games don't even let you play. If you adored Evolve while it was still around and you wanted a replacement, the worst news is that there really isn't one. If you look up any discussion surrounding the game, their main answer is pretty much always, oh, it's try Dead by Daylight. I don't hate Dead by Daylight. In fact, I quite enjoy the game myself, but it's never really scratched that Evolve itch. The only similarity they share is that the game is structured as a 4v1. Evolve's dynamic was intense, fair on both sides, and an unmistakably special feeling. A feeling that still has not been replicated to this day. At this point, it's unlikely we'll ever see a reboot or a sequel. Despite the game's enthusiastic fanbase, Turtle Rock, the developers, have been dead silent for a really long time. Evolve's story is not exactly like Anthem's, though. Anthem's death can be attributed to the many external forces that resulted in an early end. Pressure from higher-ups, unreasonable deadlines, stuff like that. Evolve's own downfall was mostly on the developers themselves. A really poor monetization system, essentially designed to milk players for money. By today's standards, it really wasn't even that bad. I could list off a dozen games with much worse monetization than Evolve, but in 2015, you couldn't. The kind of money they were asking for was a death sentence. $1.99 for a skin pack? Ridiculous. $2.99 for a skin pack? Insane. And yet, if you look at what's being offered today for 5 times those prices in pretty much every game out, it's laughable. But that wasn't commonplace in 2015, and people didn't think like that. Evolve got crazy, and people stopped playing it. It was a PvP game, so when people aren't playing a PvP game, no one else is going to want to play a PvP game, because it takes a while to find a match. So Evolve died. Development stopped, its servers went down, and the rest is history, forgotten, gone with the wind. There's a certain level of blame that can be distributed to pretty much every party involved, but in the end it was 2K, Evolve's publisher, that forced Turtle Rock to stop making the content and shelf the game permanently. Both the games I've gone into detail on went down quite a while ago, but it doesn't mean that the problem ever went away. Recently, the crew was announced to be permanently shutting down. I mentioned this earlier, but I'd like to go into a bit more detail. This is the first crew, specifically, a game older than Evolve, which was released to mostly positive and some mixed reviews. Despite that, a lot of people loved this game. As of March 31st, the crew will no longer be playable. At all. This game that people spent money on is being ripped away from them, and it'll never be given back. They could just as easily add an offline mode before taking it down, but they won't. The people who owned the crew will still own the crew in name. It'll still be in their library, they'll still have the disc, but they will never be able to play it again. I'm pretty sure you get the idea at this point, but I'll keep going. Friday the 13th just announced that the servers will be going down as of December 2024, rendering the game completely unplayable. It is already delisted. Paragon, the Epic Games MOBA, went down entirely in 2018. They did put every single one of their assets up for free though, so good on them for that. Marvel's Avengers, despite having an endless cascade of problems, also had its dedicated fans. Unfortunately, it's since been delisted, but servers are still up, so it could always be worse. Gigantic, a long-gone MOBA, was stuck in publishing hell for a long time, bouncing between different platforms before indefinitely falling off the face of the earth. The Cycle Frontier was a PvPvE shooter with a lot of potential and an enthusiastic community. It shut down in September last year. Hyperscape, yet another Ubisoft game, ironically, was completely retired in April of 2022. While these are seemingly unrelated killings, they all share a couple of things in common. Primarily, the motive. Despite being committed by a vast network of criminals, each murderer is after one thing, the money, except for a couple of cases. While our victims weren't necessarily draining the pockets of each company, it does cost money to keep servers open, and that's a fact. The exact amount is unknown to me, but I can't imagine keeping servers open, especially when a game isn't getting that much attention, would be financially positive. In times of doubt, it's important to see both sides of the story, and there's a tiny little fragment of me that sort of sympathizes with them. Why keep something operable if it's a net negative? If you're pouring money into the servers but getting little to nothing in return, what's the point? Well, let me tell you. The truth is, shutting a game down for good can be a net negative too. In cases like Anthem, where it's still up, it prevents the game from being valuable in the future since it's not getting any development, it's not getting any news, it's not getting any new players. Not only will it cause existing players to be discouraged and stop not only playing, but spending, but it also means that nothing will come of that IP at any point later down the road. It's even worse with examples like Evolve, which brings me to the second common denominator. In almost each and every story we've looked at, there's a blatant disregard for how the consumer is affected. Of course, sometimes it's out of the control of the developers, but somewhere in the chain of command, this disregard is present. With Anthem, the EA higher-ups forced the game out early and later forced development to stop. Even though the game is still online, what might have been someone's favorite game or turned into an actual gem at some point is soured forever. With Evolve, the developer's monetization model killed it. By scrounging for every dollar they could get, the community lost trust in a game that had a really amazing core. It's hard to say if this model was actually the developer's plan or a mandate from 2K to make the game more profitable, but either way, it pretty much caused the downfall of Evolve. The crew stayed up for a long time, and that's respectable on its own, but it doesn't mean it should be unplayable forever. The most egregious disrespect for gamers is not when the servers are struck down permanently, it's when the servers are struck down permanently and there's no option for people who still want to play the game. Evolve, The Crew, Friday the 13th, Paragon, and whatever other game I've neglected to mention in this video, there's one thing they could have done. Upon closing the game forever, all they needed to add was a solo play mode, add in simple bot functionality if it's necessary, or some sort of self-sustained peer-to-peer matchmaking. Thousands of games have done it. It's an absurdly simple solution to a really complicated problem. It would dampen the blow to your reputation, and people would respect you for respecting the time and money that they've dedicated to your game. Once you factor in the idea that shutting these games down permanently is effectively redacting people's ownership of them, it creates yet another issue. There are about 1 billion problems that even a toddler could identify in these schemes, and I'm sure that same toddler could probably come up with something to fix them too. Underneath all of those overlying problems though, there's one big one. There are solutions available. Even though they exist and they're not even all that difficult to pull off, these companies don't want to. They don't want to pay people any extra to give their games a proper send-off. They don't want to put in that effort. They don't even care enough about their reputation to try and salvage it. They are in it for the money. Having not listened to us for years, what makes us think that they're going to now? Unlike most cold cases, this should be easily solvable. A thorough list of charges, mountains of evidence, even definitive perpetrators. This is a huge problem. A problem that we can talk about endlessly, yet there's very little we can actually do. There's not even one or just a couple of names that we can pick out as main offenders, as this is an industry-wide problem. And it keeps getting bigger. So big that at this point, I'm not sure that it will ever stop. Thank you all so much for watching. This video pretty much only got made because another creator and a friend of mine were discussing The Crew in my Discord. That other creator is jcox98, who makes videos on games as well, sort of like me, but a lot better. They're hilarious and completely blow my own content out of the water, so go check out their channel, which will be linked in the description. You won't regret it. The other person I mentioned is Conveere, a good friend who helps me out with my thumbnails. He doesn't have a channel to check out, but he's lovely and has done a ton for me, so everyone thank him in the comments for me, and if you need some graphic design work, you can probably reach out to him. All my sources, music used, and other social media will also be in the description. For my regular viewers, apologies for the delay on this video. As usual, it ended up being a little bit more ambitious of a project than I originally planned, so it needed some more time between rewrites and a lot of script changes and stuff like that. So hopefully that extra time showed in the final product. If you did enjoy the video, and I sincerely hope that you did, I would really appreciate it if you were to like the video and maybe even comment what games you missed the most. If you're new around here, I also highly urge you to subscribe for more content like this. That's pretty much all I have to say today, so again, thank you all so much for tuning in and sticking around till the end. Have a great night, and I'll catch you in the next one.